this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Hey, it's Haley Steinfeld. When everything requires your attention, it can be tough to figure out what to prioritize. But I'm here to talk to you about something that you should always put first, your breast health. In fact, if you're 40 and over, you should be getting screened once a year. And if you're under 40, it's never too soon to visit yourattentionplease.com to learn about your breast cancer risk. So go on, pay the girls some attention and take the time to find out your breast cancer risk at yourattentionplease.com. Trust me, your future self will thank you.
Wasabi is purpose-built to free your business from skyrocketing storage costs and fees. Wasabi is the go-to provider for professional and collegiate sports teams around the world. Check out Wasabi's AI-enabled intelligent media storage, Wasabi Air, to the industry's only cloud storage service with triple protection against cyber criminals. Wasabi, driving innovation in data storage for up to 80% less than market competition. Try for free at wasabi.com. Wasabi Hot Cloud Storage, proud partner of the iHeart Podcast Network.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 1082 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, thanks for tuning in. Before getting to the mailbag questions today, I just want to send another reminder that the Late Round Prospect Guide is currently available for pre-order. This year's guide lets you know everything that goes in the ZAP model. It's got profiles for every running back, wide receiver, and tight end going to the NFL Combine. And there's also the year 2 profiles. I have my year 2 model for second-year NFL players. I've got a little over 30 profiles for running backs and wide receivers in this guide too. Basically, there's a ton in this guide. And you can pre-order it right now for $14.99 over on lateround.com. That's going to go up to $19.99 when the guide launches in mid-March. Again, just head to lateround.com and you can learn more there. The first question this week is from Twitter. It's from @SF_DavidGeo. It says, as you dig into the prospects, have you noticed any more impact of this transfer era now that there's a larger sample? Or does teammate score account for it enough? So modeling was definitely a little bit more straightforward before players started transferring the way that they are right now. Mostly in that things were a little bit more contained and a little bit more controlled. You could more easily do things like account for teammate competition. Teammate score, though, is a complicated thing to really nail down from a statistical perspective. I've been thinking about this a lot with Jadarian Price in particular this year, with him having played behind Jeremiah Love. On one hand, you're going to hear people say, of course his production profile sucked. He played behind Jeremiah Love. I actually got an email about that this week. And it's an incredibly valid thing to say. For the record, Tuesday's show was just me talking about production only. But on the other hand, yeah, we may not have many instances where a legit running back played behind a stud like this. But it's not like we haven't seen split backfields in college in the past with multiple NFL backs. You can look at Ohio State just last year, and we can give those players a little bit of a boost. It's just a question of how much, and that's where you can really get yourself into trouble. I mean, think about Roschon Johnson. He plays behind Bijan Robinson in college, and so we excuse away some of his lack of production. But he hasn't been usable in the NFL. So if we make too many excuses, it can lead to misses in our evaluation. Now, I think I've built a reasonable teammate score that can properly boost a player like Price. He'll be right there from a ZAP score perspective with Jonah Coleman and Emmett Johnson, more than likely, which I think is fair right now here in February. But what does make teammate score a little difficult is that number one, what I just talked about, which is knowing the degree in which you should boost a player's profile. But then there's number two, which is underclassmen. For my teammate score, I'm essentially looking at the final 2 years of a player's career to see if he played with anyone good. And I help define good by draft capital. So Jadarian Price, he gets a boost for playing with a guy who's likely going to be a top 10, top 15 pick. But think Jackson Smith-Njigba on the wide receiver side. He played alongside some really good wide receivers in college. His sophomore season was insane. And he was playing with Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, who were early first-round picks. So the model can recognize that because they came out a year before he did. But Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, their teammate scores, it was boosted because they played with each other, yes, and they were coming out in the same draft class. But their teammate score didn't recognize how good Jackson Smith-Njigba was because JSN came out a year later. Like, look at Carnell Tate this year. Tate has a good production profile, but he's playing alongside Jeremiah Smith. Now, we know that Smith is going to be looked at favorably when he eventually comes out, but you can probably start to see where things become kind of an issue from a modeling perspective. I can make that claim pretty confidently for Smith, but where do you draw the line? All of a sudden, if you're projecting the underclassmen, you're injecting a lot of subjectivity that can easily do more harm than good with a model. So teammate score is not perfect to begin with. The transfer stuff, it's not as big of a deal though, because I can model things to recognize teammates at different schools. The bigger problem for teammate score is that it's just hard to capture properly. It does get signal in the model, but I try to find the right balance. What the transfer era has done, the bigger impact that has nothing to do with teammate score, it's made classes generally older, and we have fewer early declares too. Now, to be clear, I don't think this is only transfer related. It's just a piece of the pie. Something that I think is playing a huge role is the COVID season. That shifted eligibility and kept players in school a lot longer. So the short-term data, it's going to be skewed higher than what we'll probably see in 2027, 2028, and beyond. So it's the transfer era, it's the COVID era, and there's also NIL. At least some players are going to stick around school longer because they can still make money doing so, all while hoping to improve their draft stock. But let's focus on the transfer stuff. Transferring comes into play with age because it gives players an out. Rather than having to sit out a year, they can now immediately go somewhere else and play. Which means if a player's contemplating going to the NFL, where he might be looked at slightly unfavorably, maybe as like a fringe day 2 to day 3 pick, he might say, screw it. I want to find a better situation somewhere else in college, and I want to improve my draft stock. I'm going to stay in college. I tweeted this the other day, but just look at recent running back draft classes. If you look at the last 3 draft classes at running back, 2024, 2025, and then this year, 2026, when we look at running backs who are in the ZAP model, which is every back who is either drafted or at the NFL Combine since 2011. From 2011 through 2023, we had 11 running backs who were 24 years or older by the time they're drafted. Over the last 3 years, 2024, 2025, and 2026, just 3 draft classes, we've had 15 of those backs. So we've far surpassed that mark of 24 years old in just 3 seasons. Meanwhile, early declares are dropping. Now, I care more about declare status at wide receiver, so let's just look there. From 2011 through 2023, we frequently saw 10 or more early declare wide receivers with each draft class. Over the last 3 years, we've had fewer than 20 total. What's happening is typically only the best wide receivers are now declaring early. Because like I said, college players now have more outs. It's not only due to transferring, but that's definitely playing a role. Now, I know the common response to this type of thing is, well, your model isn't capturing those things properly now because the model's tested off of data that goes back to 2011 and the landscape has changed. Yes, that's true. The landscape is different. With that being said, younger players are still generally better bets than older players are. And you can still look at this through the lens of age-adjusted production. That hasn't really changed. Maybe it's a little bit more difficult for players to break out early because now there are older, more capable guys that are sticking around college. But let's not pretend that sample is massive. We only have 20 running backs at the Combine this year. There are fewer than 50 wide receivers. And a lot of them, they won't be relevant in the NFL. We're just talking about a handful of cases for the most part, in the grand scheme of college football. And as usual, guys, the model isn't there to just give you answers. It's to keep you level-headed and to guide you, to help you know when to deviate from draft capital. And I think it still does a great job of doing that despite the changes across college football. This next question is from Joey from Patreon. It says, hey JJ, wanted to pick your brain on Luther Burden. I know you mentioned him as a buy, and the general fantasy community is projecting a breakout. What's your guess as to why he isn't getting on the field? The injury in training camp? Limited deployment a la Jaden Reed? I have him on a bad dynasty team and wondering if trading him for a player within your tiers makes sense. Thanks. I will say, if consensus becomes very, very, very bullish on Burden, then there's a chance I'd be out on him. Remember, this is all related to cost. I think Burden is an awesome player for many reasons. But as you're noting here, there are still some red flags. One being overall usage. Burden didn't have a 70% route share in any game last year. DJ Moore was at an 86% route share all season long. Rome Odunze, 88%. Burden, even when he started to get more run, was still in that 60 to 70% range. That's why anything we do with Burden is based on projection, not something that we've consistently seen. Now, I will say, I don't think this is a Jaden Reed situation at all, for a couple of reasons. First, their deployment wasn't the same as rookies. Reed ran 76% of his routes out of the slot as a first-year player. Burden gets pegged as a slot guy, and he definitely profiles as someone who can do that given what he did in college. But in 2025, he ran out of the slot on just 45% of his routes run. He played plenty on the outside. Burden also had one of the best yards per route run rates that we've ever seen from a rookie wide receiver, at least over the last 15 years. And he even had a better targets per route run rate than Jaden Reed did as a rookie. And Burden was a better prospect by a wide margin. That's not a hindsight take either. And look, another thing to remember when we point out these singular outcomes is that circumstances just won't be the same from one team to the next. Reed has been good, not great, at least as a fantasy asset. But in saying that, we're also assuming the Packers are using him optimally, which in my opinion, they should allow him to do more on the perimeter. We can't assume the Bears are going to do that exact same thing with Luther Burden. But here's what I'll say about Burden. The raw volume was not there. That's the red flag to this profile. We didn't see him as a full-time player. Why that didn't happen, which is what your question's asking, we're never going to know for sure. We're not in that front office. We're not in that locker room. We're not in the coaches' meetings. My guess, though, is that he was a little bit raw coming out as a prospect. He was injured early on. It's not an easy offense just immediately learn. And there's decent competition within that offense. So I think it's a multitude of factors. That doesn't mean that things will definitely change. The reason to be bullish on Burden is because based on him seeing the work that he saw, he was great. What he was asked to do, he looked the part. You can visually see that when you watch him play, and you can look at the data too. We're trying to project that trajectory. It wouldn't be the first time that a player took a step forward after having good peripherals and not a ton of volume in year one. But that lack of volume is also why we're not ranking him close to a Tetero McMillan. There's more downside risk. I think the upside is not that far off from someone like T-Mac, especially when you consider team environment. But what's different is the downside. What if Luther Burden's route share doesn't grow? What if this is all small sample size noise? So when we evaluate, we don't need to say that this is definitely going to happen or this definitely won't happen. That's not the way that I look at this stuff. That's not the way that anyone should look at this stuff. Don't think in absolutes. And when I do that, when I weigh the upside with the downside, I think that Luther Burden is a little bit undervalued by the dynasty market. I don't think it's super egregious, but I have him ranked higher than the market does. And admittedly, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that I liked him a lot as a prospect. His ZAP score was amazing. It'd be one thing if he did this while the model didn't like him coming out. Instead, it's showing that he's been really effective at every stop so far. His year 2 score, it's not that much different from Emeka Egbuka's. And Egbuka is ranked significantly higher within the dynasty market. That's not a knock on Egbuka either. That's just me noting that Luther Burden looks like a great upside play. But when you're looking to trade for him, just make sure you're not ignoring that downside risk. Because yes, the volume, the usage, the route share, that's still definitely a red flag for Luther Burden. This next question is from Fat Gold Chain on Patreon. It says, looking good today, JJ. Thanks. In a recent episode, you mentioned that a rookie running back's year 1 ZAP score was actually more predictive than year 1 fantasy points per game. With that in mind, what do we do about Kaleb Johnson? Yeah, I talked through that on the Late Round Fantasy Football Show on Wednesday too. About how a player's ZAP score is more predictive for year 2 through 4 fantasy production than his year 1 PPR points per game rate. Or I should say it helps explain that production more. Now, when I say things like that, I don't want anyone to think that it just completely overrides everything else. I just mean that if you were to isolate those specific metrics, you'd be better off using a player's prospect score compared to his year 1 PPR point per game production. With Kaleb Johnson, unfortunately, even with the updates that I made to the ZAP model this offseason, it still thinks that he was a good prospect. It's just a model miss. But I've written up Kaleb Johnson's year 2 profile in the prospect guide. And when I was doing the research, I looked at running backs picked on day 2 who failed to reach 50 rushing attempts as a rookie since 2011. There actually have been some spike seasons for those players in that group in years 2 through 4. The problem is that group is not very inspiring. Just hear the names: Shane Vereen, Kenyon Drake, Ronald Jones, Damian Harris, Darrell Henderson. Johnson lands in the flex play category in that year 2 model with a bunch of other guys from last year's draft class. But I don't see how we can be very bullish here. It feels like the Jalen Polk situation last year, but at running back. Fortunately, we can anchor a little bit more to that running back prospect score. But I'd be pretty surprised if Kaleb Johnson ends up being something that we're desperately wanting on our fantasy rosters. It's a model miss, though. I'm just glad I avoided him in redraft this past year. This next question is from @Bricks42. It says, you mentioned using only rate stats, yards per team pass attempt, rather than raw stats, total receiving yards. Have you ever tried any kind of blend of both? So I'm assuming you're referring to the prospecting work since you're referencing yards per team pass attempt. I've tested a ton of statistics through the years. What you guys hear me talk about is the best combination of factors that I've found to go along with things like draft capital, size, teammate score, and so on. But I wanted to talk about this because I think it's really important. When you hear the word per, as in per attempt, or per rush, or per route run, it's very easy to automatically think of a rate stat, that those metrics are rate stats. Most of them are. Rushing yards per rush, that's a rate stat. It tells you nothing about volume, just about what happens per individual rush. But some of these metrics disguise themselves as volume-based metrics. Receiving yards per team pass attempt is actually capturing volume. Think about it. It's total receiving yards gained divided by the number of pass attempts a team has. When we refer to volume, we're often talking about a player being on the field, so snaps, and then running routes run, and then seeing targets, and then getting yards. The more of those things that a player has, the better he is generally in fantasy football. That's volume. Receiving yards is a volume-based number. A player could see 0 yards in a game, which we'd assume meant that he didn't see that much volume. And then team pass attempts is just a way to sort of smooth things out for the type of offense that player might be playing in. So in order for a player to be really good in receiving yards per team pass attempt, he's going to probably need to be seeing a good bit of volume. Or he's just insanely efficient. But over a larger sample, that ends up normalizing. Unless you're in an offense like Navy's or something where you just need more context. The same is true with total yards per team play. Total yards is capturing both rushing and receiving. And then we're just normalizing for the amount of plays run by an offense. But a player who's ranking high there within that metric, he can get there by either being a volume hog on the ground or through the air. But it's capturing a lot of things that we inherently want to capture. Volume means a team is intending to use a player in a certain way, or that the player is probably pretty talented. In a metric like receiving yards per team pass attempt, it's capturing that to some degree. But then also it's still going to capture some efficiency, because players can still rank high enough if they're insanely efficient. And then it's equalizing things by dividing that by some team total. So yes, I've tested all sorts of metrics. But I do think it's common for people to view some of these numbers as rate stats when they're actually capturing volume. When you look at per rush or per reception, you're only looking at a player's volume itself. Plays when the player is involved. When you change that denominator to be the entire team environment, you're all of a sudden shifting the meaning of that metric, which is why those numbers can actually be pretty powerful, both in college and NFL analysis. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening this week, everyone. Greatly appreciate you. Have a great weekend, and I'll catch you next week.
You know how it's never really about where you're going? It's about who you're going with. The right people can turn any drive into a great memory. That's something Toyota really believes. They design vehicles around real life and real people, the ones who make plans happen and bring everyone together. Inside, everything's built with passengers in mind. Comfortable seating, smart layouts, and space that actually works so everyone can relax and enjoy the ride. There's room for the people, room for the stuff, and room for the moments that happen along the way. Because when people are the destination, your ride is important. Learn more at Toyota.com and find the vehicle that fits your people.
This podcast is supported by FX's Love Story, John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette. The new limited series from executive producer Ryan Murphy. It explores the complex courtship of the iconic couple considered to be American royalty, whose love story captured the attention of the nation. Their fairy tale romance would unfold in front of the public eye, where their private love would also become a national obsession. FX's Love Story, John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette. Watch now on FX, Hulu, and Hulu on Disney Plus for bundle subscribers.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.